Welcome to today's webinar, everyone, Remote Work Beyond COVID-19 Practical and Legal Considerations. I am Anna Hobson from HR Simple, and I will be moderating today. Our presenter is Greg Grisham from Fisher Phillips, and we have just a few housekeeping tasks to go over before we get started with the presentation. If you have any questions, please enter them in the question box, and Greg will get to those at the end of the webinar. If you need any more COVID-19 resources or would like to watch more coronavirus webinars, please go to hrsimple.com/events. We have a number of recordings posted there that were presented by Greg that I would recommend watching. HR Simple provides state human resource manuals as well as 6 federal manuals ranging from topics like wages and hours to employee benefits. Today, you can use the code up on the screen for 40% off your entire purchase for attending today. And before we get started on the webinar, let's learn a little bit more about Greg. Greg Grisham is of counsel in the Memphis office. He is currently a part of the Fisher Phillips COVID-19 task force. For 30 years, Greg has successfully counseled and represented employers in all areas of labor and employment law. He has successfully litigated hundreds of administrative charges, employment lawsuits, and arbitration demands on behalf of employers, including federal and state law claims. Greg also represents employers before the NLRB in unfair labor practice proceedings. Additionally, he represents employers in the enforcement of post-employment restrictive covenants such as non-compete, non-solicitation, and non-disclosure agreements and related trade secret litigation. So on that note, I'm going to hand things over to Greg so we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. Well, very good. Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everybody, to our program today. As Anna said, I'm Greg Grisham with Fisher Phillips. I work in the Memphis office, and I always appreciate the opportunity to do webinars for HR Simple. Enjoy working with them, and hopefully you can walk away and learn something today. Remote work, I'll have to be honest with you, I've never done a seminar or a webinar simply about remote work. Remote work has always come up, usually comes up when you're talking about Americans with Disabilities Act. You're talking about reasonable accommodation. It's had a bit of a controversial history. And cases have kind of gone all over the place, including in the Sixth Circuit where I've practiced. But in light of all the COVID-19, really the transformation that occurred when pretty much everybody had to go, who were able to do it and work remotely, including our firm, starting about the middle of March. Pretty much our entire firm started working remotely, and did so for a long time. Now we're back in the office. We still work a lot remotely, but it was quite an experience. Growing, I have 3 children, and when my children were younger, I spent a lot of time. I would stay at home when they were sick often, but I had my laptop and cell phone and Wi-Fi connection, and for years. A lot of us have been fortunate to have the option to work remotely when we needed to. So now I thought it was important enough to put together a seminar just talking strictly about remote work. So that's going to be the lead subject today. We're not going to give a seminar today about COVID-19. I think everybody is probably attended enough of those webinars. But COVID-19 is relevant because it's really fostering a lot of this change, and so we will obviously mention it as we go through today. So anyway, let's get started with that. Let's talk about remote work before COVID-19. There's been a trend for a long time toward more people working remotely, at least part of the time. There haven't really been that many people who work remotely all the time, but a lot of people, were working, from home periodically. And most of us like doing that. I like doing it. But you had a lot of people in the business world, and that includes the legal community, law firms, who always felt like people need to be in the office. And there are obviously a lot of benefits to that. One of the things I do is I help train younger attorneys, pass on the knowledge and mentor them. And, it's a lot more difficult to mentor younger, newer employees when you're not there with them, because a lot of stuff just sort of happens on the fly. So having an office presence, depending on the business you're in, it's probably never going to completely vanish, but it's really more of a shift toward where you work, where do you work more. But a lot of people do believe that, people should be in the office. And some of those folks are still around, although I think their attitudes have been softened about that somewhat. Remote working, once again, was limited to certain positions. IT people, a lot of IT people work remotely. Salespeople, covered a sales territory who weren't really connected closely to an office. But you had things, you had performance management, productivity issues. Companies always kind of struggle. How do we evaluate people who aren't here? We can't see them. There was always a question, are they going to be as productive at home as they are here? Because there are a lot of distractions. You can turn on if you're at home, you can turn on your TV and, have the news going, have some background noise. You got your dog barking, you got people mowing their yard, you got a lot of distractions. So there are a lot of, despite the trend of working remotely more, you had a lot of people scratching their heads to say, is this going to be something that's going to become mainstream, before all this happened? And before it happened, this pre-COVID-19 remote work statistics, about 4.7 million people were already working remotely from home before all this started. It's a fairly small fraction of the workforce, 3.4%, but that's a significant amount. And and this would include, I think, people who are working full-time and part-time, working remotely. So, and it had been increasing. If you look at statistics, it had been increasing a little bit every year. We had a fairly good slow trend coming up to the spring of 2020. All right, so COVID-19 hits, and what do companies do? Well, there was a global survey conducted by Gartner, Inc. That found 88% of all business organizations across the globe either mandate or encourage their employees to work from home. And this was all done really to try to prohibit the virus from spreading. It was really a health and safety thing to protect the workers, protect other people. But everybody got on board with this, and all of a sudden, working remotely went from being something only a few companies did to something that everybody felt forced to do, kind of overnight. And we were fortunate as a law firm; we had the technology in place to be able to pull it off. A lot of companies, if their technology wasn't up to date or they were in the process of changing, some people had some difficulty with it. But that's the reality, 88%. So the question is going to remain after this, where are we going to go from here? COVID-19, unfortunately, seems to be made a bit of a comeback. We have a spike now pretty much everywhere. I know we do in the Memphis area. So, where are we going to go from here? We're still really in that COVID period. Hopefully the vaccine will become available here in a couple of months. Will help change that dynamic. That's kind of where we are right now. All right, so where do we think we're going to go in the future? Well, the survey that I was mentioning to you by Gartner, 74% of CFOs and finance leaders say they're going to move at least 5% of their employees to remote working permanently after the pandemic. So, that's a pretty significant move. We saw pre-COVID what the percentage is, and it looks like you've got really 3/4 of CFOs surveyed are going to be looking at permanent remote working for a significant percentage of the workforce. 25% of the companies that responded are going to move 10% of their workforce to remote work permanently. So you see, you can see that there's a willingness now, I guess, since they've had the experience of having a big percentage of their workforce, if not all, working at home. They're more open to it now. 4% plan to have about 50% of the remote workforce post-pandemic. So we got, the trend that started a number of years ago that kept creeping up, went way up quickly. And so now, while a lot of people will be recalled to work and work in the office, a lot of people who work remotely are going to, some percentage of those people will continue to work at home, work remotely, possibly permanently, and others will likely be permitted to work at home at least some of the time. And what's really driving that? Well, for a lot of businesses, their two major costs are their employees, the labor costs, and the cost of their facilities. And if you can certainly reduce your footprint, if you can have less commercial office space, which a lot of companies that have the type of business that you need an office, service type industry, corporate headquarters, things like that, you can save a lot of money by cutting back on the space that you need. A lot of lawyers with remote work, I've always liked having a nice office and have been fortunate to have one, but honestly, I would be certainly happy to share my office with another attorney, so we could cut back on space. So I think law firms and other companies are going to be doing that, but there's a huge cost savings there. Of course, that doesn't help the commercial real estate industry, but companies can save a lot. They found out they can save a lot of money, and still get the work done by having people work at home. All right, well, this is really interesting. Now, this is not good for lawyers, I'll have to tell you, but it's good for employers. Through the first 9 months of this year, believe it or not, every year we get used to claims going up. They're always increasing. But in the first 9 months, there's been a 12% decrease in federal employment cases from last year. But also a 16% decrease from the average from 2010 to 2019. So the fact there's a decrease, and that big of a decrease, that's good for companies. There's a big cost savings there. It's good for companies that have EPLI insurance. You have fewer claims. It means your premiums won't be increased. So you're saving money there. And look at this: significant decreases in harassment, 22%, ADA 20%, discrimination 17%. And a lot of that is like in the harassment area. Just think about it. Harassment. Most of the harassment, although it can certainly occur, in cyberspace and different, off-site, but most of the harassment cases I've been involved in and defended over the years have happened in the workplace. So if people aren't in the workplace, working together, there's less contact. There are going to be fewer cases, and this makes sense that this would be what we're seeing here. So good. This is good for employers. I think though, as people come back, and that's been slowed somewhat by the spike. I think though, as a remote work, the percentage of people working remotely increases. I think you'll see some stabilizing in the number of charges and maybe a permanent drop in the number of charges. So this is a good trend for employers. What are some other benefits of remote work for employers? Well, Forbes had an interesting, sharing this. This is an article from Forbes, pulling out some stuff here, but they looked at 5 different areas. Productivity, teleworkers on average are 35 to 40% more productive than their office counterparts. Now, that's something that I wouldn't have thought. I would have thought it would, they might possibly be a little bit more productive or maybe even less productive, but that's significant. And that's certainly another, area of cost savings for employers if the people can be disciplined enough to, focus on work while they're outside the office. It looks like as well, the survey found that there were fewer quality defects. So you had higher, better quality control. I guess fewer do-overs when you were able to work remotely. Engagement. Think about it. A lot of people miss work. You don't want people coming to work if they have the flu or they're, have something contagious potentially, but maybe they're not sick enough. They need to go lay in bed or whatever. But so a lot of people, maybe you have a mild fever or something that's mildly contagious. They can work at home remotely, and they're not coming in the workplace and making other people sick. So you end up with lower absenteeism. If people are too sick, if they, aren't able to focus on work, it's one thing. But a lot of times the level of illness, doesn't disqualify somebody from working, particularly if they're doing it remotely. Retention. A lot of people, given the life situations, family situations of people, having flexibility is something that people value a lot. You can see it in all the surveys. And if people have flexibility, if they can be able to go do things during the day, a lot of people have had to basically homeschool their kids or help make sure their kids are on task with their schools, since a lot of the schools have been online, learning's been online. This helps people really, I think, have a stronger affinity with the organization and cuts down on turnover. And of course, turnover is very very expensive for employers, as everybody knows. And profitability. Organizations save an average of $11,000 per year per part-time telecommuter, or 21% higher profitability. So, there are 5 good reasons there, apart from the others we mentioned, why companies really ought to look at remote work. So I can't see folks here, but the question is, has your company adopted a remote work from home policy? Well, I can't see folks here, but probably I would say a number of you have. And if you haven't, it's probably a good idea to do it, because that's remote work, definitely for the reasons we've been talking about, it's going to be here to stay. So we've looked at the benefits of remote work, really from the employee standpoint and also from the employer standpoint. But what are the downsides of it? Are there any downsides? Well, it's always fun to look at surveys and get a feel for what people are thinking. And this is a list of things from a survey, and I've cited the source of it below. It could be lonely. I know, at least when I first, you have your family with you in your house. A lot of people do, but if you're you're there, you're not interacting with your people at work like you do. A lot of us, I'm fine working alone, isolated, but I enjoy interacting with people. I really do. And so I think the biggest adjustment for me, at least, when we went remote work, was just getting used to not going in the office and seeing other people, people at work. I saw, my family, but so it's kind of lonely in that sense. So I can identify with that. You got home office, you got distractions going on. It's funny. I don't know how many Zoom meetings I've done since all this started, but a lot of them. And, pretty much everybody who's working at home, a lot of them have barking dogs going on, or their kids, or you can hear all kinds of noise going on. So, you can hear somebody mowing their grass outside. So you have a lot of noise distractions. And of course, if you're in your home, you have a lot of, things that you're interested in doing. You can take breaks, and so there are a lot of distractions. Pure spontaneous conversations. I know, in our business, the legal business at least, I can be sitting here working, thinking about a case, and I'll have a brainstorm about one, and it's always fun to go talk to, a colleague about it and kind of brainstorm it out. Well, it's harder to do that if you're, working remotely. Everybody's not together, which is at least at the forefront, can be difficult to collaborate. You can certainly, email back and forth. You can talk on the phone. You can have a Zoom meeting, but it's not the same. Career advancement takes extra work. If you're trying to advance yourself, your boss is not, you're not, in the same location with your boss. They're somewhere else. You're not there. So you wonder sometimes, are your efforts being rewarded, being watched or rewarded? So that could be a problem. Learning and mentorship. It's harder to mentor people. I've been mentoring, attorneys through this remote time, but it is more difficult to do. A few other challenges, employees. It's easier to be sedentary. I know when all the gyms closed down, I like to go to the gym, and it's easy to forget to exercise when you're working at home, and it leads to weight gain. It leads to you feeling not as good. So you got to be careful about that. You may work. I'll just mention a couple of these things. You may work too much. Unless you have a real fixed time that you're going to work. We're going to talk about that. That's really ideal to have, periods where you're going to work and have that all sit out. If you're a professional and your only requirement is to get your work done and get it done well, you can plan a lot of your work day. So you may get up in the morning and, go do something and come back and work for a while. You may fix yourself lunch, and you may find that you're up at 2 o'clock in the morning working. So technology has sort of led to the workday, kind of going on, which people don't know exactly when quitting time is anymore. It's more difficult. So, and you also, have technical equipment issues. I think, some of the broadband connectivity got burdened quite a bit when everybody, went to working remotely. But I think that's settled, been worked out for the most part, at least. So there are a lot of things here, a lot of, some negatives that are there for employees, at least, that, employers need to be aware of and try to deal with and help remote workers be more comfortable and satisfied doing it. So remote work policies. Once again, if you don't have a remote work policy, you really, really should. And it's important when you do that to, have required work hours, particularly if you're dealing with non-exempt people. Non-exempt people working, outside the office is a bit of a, white knuckle ride, so to speak. You got to be careful and make sure that you control it, because you're not there physically to do it, to watch. But you need to, sit down what the hours are going to be. A lot of times now where you have kids at home and, the employee's trying to kind of be a teacher and, supervise the child and work at the same time, you may have to say, well, you need to work from this time to this time, and then take a break and come back and do it. So get all that as nailed down as you can, because that's very important. And also meal rest periods. You know, a lot of states, Tennessee is a state that requires a 30-minute unpaid meal rest period, and a lot of other states do too. So you got to make sure that you know, the employees take their meal and rest period during the day, and you know, that needs to be you know, communicated to the employee, so the employee has some period of time when they go, because that employee may be working with other employees, you know, doing certain activities, so you don't need everybody off at the same time. Another thing is the employee needs to maintain a workspace free of distractions. You know, a lot of us, you know, fortunately have places we can go in our home. I tend to like to work on the kitchen table for some reason, but I've always had an office I can go to work. So it's good to go to a place where you can, you know, shut the door. You know, if you're having private conversations or whatever, you have to do that. You can't have those, you know, in the middle of your house where if anybody else is there. You know, if you have animals, you need to secure your animals. You know, you don't need to have barking animals going on to distract you or TV. So make sure that your employees understand that they need to, as much as they possibly can, limit distractions and where they work and whatnot. Time and attendance expectations. Just because you're working it remotely, you know, the employer needs to make it clear. You know, if an employee is supposed to start at 8 o'clock or 8:30 or whatever, the employee still needs to start. By working remotely, you know, you don't have to make a commute, so it gives you extra time to get ready. So there should be really no reason why the employee is not ready to go unless something happens. And also the attendance expectations. You know, you shouldn't water down your attendance expectations for people who are working remotely. You know, unless they're, you know, they have FMLA or they're off on one of the paid sick leave, emergency paid sick leave, or emergency FMLA or whatever. They need to adhere to your attendance expectations. Also, whether employees must obtain permission prior to working outside of regular work hours or working overtime. You know, that's absolutely imperative that your policies, you communicate that to employees. They're not to work beyond the normal work time unless they're, you know, seek approval or requested to. So, you know, what do you do if somebody works and they didn't get approval? Well, you pay them, of course, even if it leads to overtime, but you know, you issue them a corrective action, and you know, and it's a disciplinary issue. So you need to have all those discussions with people on the front end. Now, as COVID-19 winds down, hopefully, and you're making decisions about who to bring back and who's going to keep working at home, you got to, you know, you have a lot of things to think about. You know, you look and see how people have performed working remotely. You may have some people who did as well or better. You may have some people who just couldn't focus, and so you know, you have to decide first. You know, everybody's going to continue working remotely, or some people, and if you're going to pick and choose people, you need to have some objective basis to do it on. Another thing that you don't need to be lax on if people are working remotely is you know, is documentation. Now, documentation is always important. I know those of you on the call probably get sick of lawyers telling you need to document everything, and I know if you're an HR person, I know you're always hounding your supervisors and managers to do it. So I know you know the importance of it, but you know, everything needs to be really set out clearly when people are going to be moving or staying in a remote workplace environment instead of coming back to a physical office. You know, you got to let them know what the expectations are. You know, they need to know what their job responsibilities are. You know, what hours they're expected to work. If they have multiple things to do, they should know, when they're supposed to work on one task and then work on another task. Their supervisor needs to follow up on task completion with the employee and make sure they hold the employee accountable for working, since they're not physically there with them. And you just have to do it like you would if the person was there. If you have somebody who's not performing well, in the office, if someone's not performing well, what do? Well, you try to have a talk with them at first and, find out what the problem is. But, after talking to them, if it doesn't help, you need to get into more of a formal situation to try to get their attention. And the same thing needs to happen with people who are working remotely. So yeah, no backing off on documenting. I think, in some sense, it's harder. People not physically in the workplace with you if you're having to do it remotely, but you just have to, you have to do it. And you also, tracking hours is critical, just like it is when people are in the workplace. We have lots and lots and lots of FLSA collective actions going on around the country, and also hybrid state class actions get filed. So you want to make sure that you've got a good tracking way to track work hours when you have remote employees. I know a lot of people will clock in on their computer or call in, so you need to have a good system in place for that. And you also have to figure out too, if you've got 10 employees and they all work in the same job classification, and you've got 5 of them working remotely and 5 of them in the office. What do you do if one of the 5 in the office comes up with a disability of some type and wants to work, request to work remotely? Well, now that people have been able to work remotely in that job and have been able to perform all their essential job functions, it's going to be harder to, turn down a properly documented request for reasonable accommodation. So that's something to consider in terms of, sending people home. Now, a lot of, we'll get to it in a minute, sort of what the EOC's view is of people who come back after sort of being forced to go do it because of the COVID-19. Because it does have, essentially, if you let people work at home, and they're able to do their job, perform their essential job functions, then, it makes a good argument on the other side that it's not essential they be physically present in the office. So that's kind of what employers are going to be running into, I think, down the road. So at home is the new normal. People are used to working at home now. A lot of people never had before. At our firm, we had staff members, legal assistants working at home, and traditionally, I don't think legal assistants have traditionally been able to do that. So it's a new normal. But creativity, where you get into a situation where you have to, you need to get people out of the workplace and keep them productive and working, in their home or wherever, you get creative and you look for ways to do it. One thing that you've got to, not drop the ball on is employee training and engagement. I think it becomes more, I know a lot of companies will have regular, periodic Zoom calls with people in their group to talk to them, check on them, see how they're doing. But I think, you're going to see even more online training, because a remote worker, can take these training modules pretty easily on their computer, as opposed to like coming in, or they can watch a video, some live training or whatever. So I think employee training, you can't let that slip. You have to have people on track to do it, particularly in the remote work. And we'll talk in a minute about, cyber security, because that's become a big issue. And it really is, new issues arise as you have jobs that have never been worked outside the office, or being worked at home or have been, it brings up new issues on, potentially, job functions have changed. You need to look at your job descriptions and make sure that if you have remote workers, that they're actually doing what's in their job description. You may have to update your job description somewhat, but and this is particularly important if you're getting into an ADA accommodation situation, or you get into a classification. You have an exempt person who claims they're non-exempt and they want to sue you for overtime. So that job description, really getting a feel for what they're doing, if it's changed any when they go remote, it's important to have a handle on that. Wage and hour issues, exempt versus non-exempt. If our exempt employees work, at all during the week, they're entitled to be paid their full salary, unless it's, falls within one of the exceptions, where you can, withhold pay, like in if they only work on their first or last week, or they get some kind of a, safety penalty due to, safety violation or just some disciplinary violation, or if it's FMLA. So there are limits on deducting, not paying exempt employees. Non-exempt employees, our major concern there is we pay them for we have some control over when they work, and make sure they get paid, and make sure the hours get reported. So when is an employee working? We need to have a pretty clear understanding of what that is. The employee needs to know what their job is, what their expectations are. They need to know they don't, just like they're working in the physical workspace, they don't need to start working, devoting their energies to the tasks that their employer hired them to perform until they clock in. And then once they clock out, they don't need to do any more. Overtime exempt positions, once again, it's important to just periodically check your exempt employees to make sure they truly are exempt. Particularly with this situation with COVID-19 and you're getting into remote work, or your supervisor still meeting the requirements for the management executive exemption, are they supervising 2 or more employees or their equivalent, in the workplace? So you got to look at all those things. The administrative employees, that's a separate exemption. Sales employees, computer employees. You got to look at all those periodically to make sure that they're still valid. You need to make sure that your reporting and monitoring system is adequate for the task of being able to capture the work of people, more and more people who are working remotely. That periodically needs to be updated. The system needs to be checked and audited to make sure it's functioning properly. And the consequences of wage and hour violations. They're in these lawsuits. Typically you get back pay if it's a misclassification or you didn't pay people for working overtime. They get the back pay. They get liquidated damages, which is an amount equal to the back pay they didn't get, plus attorney's fees. And the attorney's fees can be higher than the wages, the recovery that the employee gets. So. These suits are always very dangerous, and these collective and class actions where you have a lot of people jumping in, they're fairly easy to get started, and they're very expensive to defend if you're an employer. So the tracking the non-exempt hours, this has always been a challenge. I think what you have to do is you just have to say, let the employee know clearly what the expectations are for their work. I think you have remote work policy and agreement that employees sign to say that their hours of work are from this point to this point. And if they have to work outside those, they have to get approval. You get people to look at their time cards, or you go online and look at them and approve them. You got to get you got to give people a chance to correct errors in their timesheet. So, you want to have that all documented. But, and over documentation is not a bad thing here. You can't let, it came up when all the COVID-19 stuff was going on that non-exempt employees, wanted to volunteer, to help out work for free. Well, if they're working for you, and they volunteer to work, you got to pay them. That's not the type of volunteering that they can do. And, if they're volunteering to work, do the work that they ordinarily do, or do work that benefits the company, then you got to look at that pretty carefully. It's hard to get that excluded, even though there was a fairly recent opinion letter that seemed to water it down a little bit. And it came out while in COVID-19 stuff, after COVID-19 stuff started. De minimis exception. Well, de minimis is there's a policy on rounding where people use time clocks that if somebody punches in, you give them a window of 5 minutes, 7 minutes, whatever, to punch in, and over time, if they punch in early or punch in late, you round it back to the start time or the quitting time, and overall, it should eventually wash out, not benefit the employer or the employee. And there's a de minimis exception. So if there are a few minutes that get lost, you can argue that we just can't keep up with it. So courts recognize that. Usually comes up in the rounding policy situation. So traditionally, working outside normal business hours, traditionally, the continuous workday rule, employees show up for work, they go to work, they get a 30-minute break or so, which is unpaid, and they work and they clock out. And so, they're supposed to be paid during that time. Now, this presented a bit of a challenge to remote people who, while the COVID-19 crisis was going on, and it's still going on today in some respects, although it's a little bit different. If your kids are home, you're supposed to be watching them or helping them out. You got to be flexible in the schedule. And of course, you've got the emergency paid sick leave and the emergency FMLA that comes into play here. But notwithstanding that, even if those two laws aren't at play, you still have to try to provide some flexibility for employees while this is going on. So what did the DOL do? Well, fortunately, the DOL came in and said that and tried to relax the rule a little bit for employers. Whether this is going to continue in a new administration remains to be seen. It may or may not be, but the DOL said that you don't have to pay people, for all the time between their first and last activities. So they've relaxed that rule, but you need to come up with a schedule, and they give an example in there where you work for a while, you do something else for a while, you get back and work for a while. So it gives you flexibility to work through the workday, and you're helping the employee's still getting their work done, which benefits the employer. So it's a cooperative thing, which really is the way things should be. So that's an important, was an important concession by the Department of Labor when they came out this summer. Now, once again, you've got to pay people. If people work, even if they work and it's not authorized, you still have to pay them. Once again, the way you deal with that is, you should have a written policy that says you can't work hours that are unauthorized, and then you discipline people if they do. And those would be hours that that they worked because they reported them, or you should have known that they worked even if they didn't. So it's pretty strict, and that's why you have to really reach out and have people verify the hours are correct. So once you do use reasonable diligence to do that and have these policies in place, if people just don't report time, you don't have any reason to know they're working, then you can't compensate them for it. So, and that would be a good defense in the event that the people file a lawsuit. Once again, exempt versus non-exempt policy and training. We talked about that. You want to make sure that your your records. You want to have accurate records. I gave a seminar about a year ago on electronic records, and it's amazing how many records that employers have to keep just under the employment law. So you want to make sure, even if your employees, whether they're in the workplace physically or they're working remotely, that your records, you have the data you need and the records, are accurate. And the way you do that is you monitor and you audit the records to make sure that that they're accurate. And when you have your normal trouble spots that we talked about, the meal and rest breaks, in states like California, states that have a lot of state laws. In Tennessee, we're pretty fortunate. We do have a meal break law, but it's fairly easy to comply with. But a lot of the states like California, New Jersey, New York, have, as many of y'all know, because you probably operate there, have a lot of state laws. And you always have to look at the state laws. I think that's where most employers get into trouble. Also, local laws now. There are a lot of local laws that deal with minimum wage and other things like that. So you got to be aware of that. So, be sure you compensate people for meeting time, training time, travel time where it's properly compensated. All those things need to people need to be paid properly. The one thing I wanted to mention too, reimbursement, expense reimbursement. That's been sort of an issue for a while. Does the employer have to reimburse employees? Well, yeah, if they, several states have laws that say that you have to reimburse somebody if you knew if they're paying for things related to business. I think California, Illinois, and Montana have pretty strict laws. Or they're using their device for work, you have to compensate them for it. So just be aware of that. The federal law is fairly lax. It just says you can't, you can't require an employee to, do expenses if you drop them below the minimum wage or whatever. So it's the federal law is not very protective. It's really more in the manner of state law here that you look at. And something I'll mention too, OSHA, the July guidance from the Department of Labor, OSHA is not going to conduct inspections of home offices. They're not going to go to employees' houses, and they're not going to hold employers liable for home offices. And employers, aren't expected to go inspect the home offices of employees. I know some companies do that to make sure, particularly if the employee is working in the medical healthcare field where you've got, concerns about HIPAA violations and whatnot, keeping data secure. But then once again, if an employee though does have an injury at home, and it's a work-related injury, the employer does have an obligation to report that under OSHA log, document the fact that the injury occurred. All right, so work location, that's important. When people are working home, they need to be in a space where they can focus on work. Their behavior, the way they look, if people have a business meeting where they're going to have to interface with a customer, or people need to dress, business casual or whatever the required dress is. You sort of have a mental picture of people showing up in their pajamas when they're working at home and nobody's dressed up. And I can't say that I haven't done that before, but you need to really make it clear what the expected behaviors are. People need to, look like they're ready for business and behave in the same manner. Data security is important. People can still have workers' comp, injuries at home, although it's certainly not not as normal as you have them at work. So you have some of these issues to look at. Now, one of the big areas we've seen a spike as in cybersecurity risk. Thieves have all, these people that are smart enough to hack into computers and come up with these viruses or whatever. There's been a big increase. I've seen a lot more phishing emails. Get a lot more of those. The spam filters don't pick them all up. So, your company needs to be training people to be able to identify these things. I know our law firm is very active in doing this and teaching us these things on a regular basis. So employers have I think employers can really up their game here on cybersecurity, and they need to, because it's amazing the number of companies that get held up for ransom with ransomware. These thieves come in and take over. So this is going to be a big area. It's going to have to be navigated as we get into more remote work, because it's just going to continue to get worse. People who are working remotely, they don't need to be, if they're in a location with other people, they don't need to leave their laptops and documents out where other people can see them. If they're having having confidential calls, they certainly need to, go to a place where they can talk, privately. You don't need to be discussing your business, in front of other people, including your family members. So you got to work hard at trying to avoid having your information and your trade secrets compromised. Now, trade secret theft. That's an area that I practice in, do a lot of that. That's becoming a much even greater thing today. But you need to, hopefully you'll have your employees will have signed a confidential non-disclosure agreement when they started with you. Sometimes I've prepared for an employer. An employee was going to go from working in the office to working out of the office, and there was concerns. It was a medical kind of situation. So we had them prepared like another confidentiality agreement, a work at home agreement. So I always have employees sign a confidentiality agreement. You got to train employees on, about how to, maintain, keep things confidential, avoid breaches. You've got to, limit access to trade secrets. Limit dissemination of things on a need-to-know basis. If people don't have any business looking at your trade secrets, you shouldn't give them access. Everything should be password protected. And also, you'd have limitations about saving things on personal devices. I think cell phones where you've got company information, these apps, these wipe clean apps that will not wipe your whole phone clean, but wipe out the company information. I've seen a lot of companies get into non-compete trade secret cases where the party employee was able to save a lot of stuff on their phone. So you got to have, you have policies in place that limit what people are able to have access to, and be able to claw it back if the person decides to leave, and cut them off from your system. So review internal data security policies. With more remote work going on in the future, all companies need to do that. Your data retention policy, which is really a document retention policy. Every company needs to have that, because you've got to maintain things for a certain period of time. Really, just in the employment, employment area, labor and employment area, you've got different deadlines or timelines for different statutes. You want to have a telework policy. We design those for our clients frequently. Bring your own device policy. This has been around for quite a while. Most companies now have those, but if you don't, you need one. And you need to be able to, have a protocol if you have a data breach. Now, most states now, including Tennessee, have statutes that have some steps that companies are required to take if you have a data breach. So, be aware of that. Be aware of the state law in the state that you're in, because that may come into play if you do have a data breach. Now, remote work is a reasonable accommodation post-COVID. Here's a very recent case from the Sixth Circuit. This came out in the spring. And in this particular case, this guy was an IT person who hurt his shoulder, and he didn't want to carry he had to carry like multiple computers around, and he didn't want to do that. So he asked for an accommodation, and the employer asking for medical documentation, and this guy didn't do it. Which one thing to know in the ADA case, you have a right to have the employee document the need for accommodation. Particularly if it's not something that's obvious to you, if it's some kind of a soft tissue injury, the employee has to do it. So here the Court of Appeals, said that there's no ADA violation here. He needed to show his work from home request was reasonable. Was this in fact a reasonable accommodation? Would he be able to do his job, working remotely? And then he also had to provide medical documentation to support the request, and he did. So this guy just didn't have those ducks lined up. But anyway, all these courts of appeals now, the case law is evolving now. I haven't seen cases post-COVID or since COVID started, dealing with ADA accommodation, remote work issues. But I mean, the analysis is going to be the same that you see. I noticed this a few days ago. This is out of Connecticut. The Connecticut school district was sued by a teacher with asthma over its no remote teaching policy. So, this suit, and it's just started, so there's really nothing to report at this point. But I think you're going to see more suits like that for people that say, well, I should, your no remote policy for my particular job, violates the ADA because it doesn't permit accommodation or whatever. So if you're an employer, and you have a position like that, and no work at home for certain things, you need to be able to demonstrate that, it's an essential job function that the person be in the workplace. That's sort of where that battle gets fought. A couple of important notices from the EOC. This came out in September. You've got a situation where people have gone and have worked at home, but because of COVID-19, the employers sent everybody home, and so when people come back to the workplace, the question is, does the employer automatically have to grant telework as a reasonable accommodation if he wants to continue, working at home, or later asked to do it, as a reasonable accommodation? The answer is no. And the EOC says that you've got to look at, let's say if working in the workplace was an essential job function before, just given the nature of the position, but the employer sent everybody home and said, okay, well, people won't have to perform that, while we're in a COVID-19 shutdown. When they come back, being in the office is truly an essential function. The ADA doesn't require the employer to disregard that to accommodate an employee. So it doesn't require the elimination of essential job functions. So that's good. But once again, we'll get to the next point. But you wonder, well, if they were able to work at home that long, able to do the job, I think it may make it more difficult for employers, to make that argument. But you got to look at the job and look at what's required of the job. It's very, very fact specific. Now, the second point, this was an update from the guidance they issued, updated guidance they issued in March. If you've got an employee who has a disability and had requested telework before, and the employer denied it, thinking that the employee couldn't do the essential job functions remotely. But the employee comes in, and then telework ends. Telework ends. People come back in the workplace. The employee wants to go and work, do telework. Can the employer refuse to do it? Well, it's not a yes or no answer. It all depends. It depends on whether or not this person would be able to, perform all the essential job functions while working remotely. But DOC says that the fact that the employee, if a particular employee did work at home while this was going on, or you had employees doing similar things that were working at home, that's going to be something that is going to be relevant to whether or not the person can do their essential job functions. So that's an important important guidance from the EOC. And finally, digital addictions. Threw this in there because I think this is probably people have digital addictions that don't just work remotely, but maybe it's more difficult that people do and they're working at home. And we may even have people in our family that are like this, and maybe even some of us are like this, where we always have to be checking our phone and checking Facebook or checking the news or whatever it may be. It's a problem around the country. I don't know that it's the same type of problem as big as other problems we have, but it is. People aren't doing their job because they're spending all their time, looking at Facebook or whatever. It is a problem. There are people that have those issues. I used to tell my kids when they came to the dinner table at night, they had to put their cell phones up because when I was growing up, we didn't have anything cool like a cell phone to play with, and we had to talk to our parents. And so I thought that was good for kids of the current generation to do, and so I made them put them up. So people can live without their cell phones at least temporarily, but they've caused some interesting changes these smartphones have. Is it a digital addiction a disability? Well, I haven't seen any cases on it, but if it is, you've got to accommodate it. The question is, what do you do? Are you having are people working at home remotely more that have this problem, or that they fall deeper into it? Does it exacerbate the problem? How do you deal with it? So anyway, if it is an ADA, it turns out to be an ADA disability, and there may be a court decision somewhere I haven't seen, then you have to accommodate or try to, with things like the EAP, some type of leave, some kind of software, they're move to a different position. There are different things that you can try to do. So anyway, folks, that's end of my presentation. I think we've been here a little bit over an hour. So I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody has. If there are any questions, Anna?
Yes, we do have a couple questions. The first one is, can an employer require employees to return to the office location after having successfully worked from home the past several months?
Yes.
Our second question is, how do we quantify and articulate the responsibilities we have to document actual time worked for non-exempt staff remote?
Well, I think for non-exempt employees, employers want to do the right thing and do the legal thing and pay people for their time worked, and you have to rely on employees to, unless you have a monitor set up where you're surveilling them all day, from start to finish, you need to make sure that they, report at the beginning of the day. Whether they use a time clock, whatever timekeeping system you use, they need to be told that they don't start work until they, clock in. We don't do work off the clock if we're non-exempt. Okay. Exempt people are kind of always on the clock, but non-exempt people, no work unless you're on the clock. So you clock in. If you when you go and have lunch, you have your lunch break, whether it's 30 minutes or an hour or whatever. You need to clock out. It's just like you would do if you're in the workplace, regular physical workplace. Just to document the fact that, hey, I've clocked out, I'm not working right now. And then you clock back in, and work the rest of the day. Because the rule is if the break is, less than 20 minutes or so, it has to be paid. I think letting people know this is your work schedule. Let's say you don't have any, you're not there trying to help your child, homeschool your child or doing that sort of thing. And you don't need to break your day up. You just need to say, look, your start time is just like it would be if you're in the office. You start at 8:30 and you work till 5, and you have lunch during this period. And and hopefully your timekeeping system, they can clock in on their computer, and you have them. They do that every day. You tell them in writing that they can't work overtime unless they're authorized. They have to be asked to. And hopefully their supervisor, if they're working on something that's important that has to be done that day, they'll authorize it, so it'll be okay. But you don't work unauthorized overtime. And then you also, I think the key thing there is when your time records are accumulated at the end of the week or the end of the pay period, you want to have the employees look and approve those hours worked. So you have something documented that they did, and that way, at least if they end up suing you down the road, you say, well, look, they verified that this was their time. And you also, make it clear when you train these employees, you have it in your handbook that, they need to report. If somebody asks them to work off the clock, they need to report it, just like they would in the regular workplace. So really the same rules apply. It's just, it's a little harder to document potentially. You're not watching these employees working remotely. But you tell them the same things you would tell somebody who's working there in the office. You just have to, we want to pay you for all your work, but you can control when they work. You're the employer and you have control over that. You can set the hours of work and hold people accountable for sticking to it. And have a policy sort of as a fail-safe. If people get their paycheck, if I get my paycheck and I worked, in the 2-week period, 85 hours, and I got paid for, 80 hours or 81 hours, you need to have a clear policy where people are to immediately report that to HR, to your payroll department, or whoever, to a specific person or department, so that can be adjusted, because you want, as an employer, you want to get in there, and mistakes do happen. I've had, there's no telling how many clients I've had that have actually overpaid people, and we've had a lot of analysis going, what's the best way to get the money back? It's usually, depending on how much it is, it's usually if it gets caught quick enough, they can just pay it all back, but sometimes they pay it back, for pay period. So you got to be careful in paying people, but it's always better to err on the side of caution and have, some redundancy built in, because, once you get into a lawsuit, you have to start paying lawyers and, go to the trouble of having to gather all this data for all these employees. I mean, it becomes as any HR person that's been through a wage and hour audit or wage and hour lawsuit, it's very time consuming to have to comply with it. All right. Anything else, Anna?
Yes. I just have one last question. It reads, what equipment is the responsibility of the employer when the employee requests to work from home? Example, desk, chairs, etc.
Well, that's a good question. If the employee, if the employer requests to work at home, let's assume they have a laptop. They have a company issued laptop, or they already have a company issued computer, and so they may have everything they need now. Supplies, for example, the computer, things that go with that, the software that's installed on it. Sometimes, I mean, I've seen employers, pay the broadband bill for the internet, or pay part of it. A lot of employers will offer to do that. But if it's at the employee's, request, at least, the employer just needs to make sure before they grant it, assuming their job would permit it, and the employee, it's the type of employee that would function well working remotely. The employee just needs to give the employer assurances that they have an adequate workspace at home. Hopefully they have a VPN of some type that's going to be, they can securely communicate, remotely on their computer. But in terms of buying somebody a desk or whatever, I don't think that's required if the employer orders the employee to work at home. And there's just not an adequate setup there. At that point, there's some argument maybe that the employer might need to, as an accommodation, provide something else, maybe a special chair, special desk or something. But ordinarily, if the employee just wants to work at home, you need to make sure they have the tools, that you provide them with the tools, the basic tools they need, like their laptop and, whatnot. Now, a lot of companies too, with cell phones, I know they'll pay some stipend for the cell phone because the employees use them in their business. But there are a lot of states now that have, like I say, California, Illinois, and Montana are the most stringent states that have passed laws on reimbursement. So if you get employees that are working at home and they, they're having to print stuff off or whatever, or buying posts and send stuff out, the employer has to reimburse them for that. So it's really that's more of the reimbursement stuff's more of a state law kind of issue than really a federal issue.
All right, Greg, I think that's all the questions we have for today.
Well, very good. Well, listen, thank you, Anna. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and look forward to visiting with you again, hopefully in 2021. And everybody be safe and have a good holiday.
Thanks so much, Greg. On behalf of everyone, we got some great information today. And again, this webinar will be up as a recording on our website within 24 hours, and I will be sending the recording and a copy of the slides to you as well. And now up on the screen should be my email and the SHRM code. If you do have any additional questions for Greg or about the presentation itself, I'd be happy to forward those along. And now I'll give everyone a couple moments to copy down the SHRM code so you make sure you can get credit. Once again, thank you so much, Greg. Thanks for coming out today, everyone. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.